Buenas tardes. Les voy a pedir a que vayan tomando asiento, por favor. Muy buenas tardes, estamos muy contentos de contar con la presencia de todos ustedes hoy aquí en la Facultad de Economía y Administración de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. Para comenzar esta ceremonia queremos agradecer la presencia de quienes nos acompañan aquí, también quienes nos acompañan a través del streaming, pero especialmente del profesor Daron Acemoglu, economista y profesor del Departamento de Economía del Massachusetts Institute of Technology, al señor Leoncio Toro, co-head de Wealth Management de Pd.D. Pactual Chile, el señor José Miguel Sánchez, decano de la Facultad de Economía y Administración. Antes de comenzar con la presentación de hoy, quisiera hacerles un recuerdo de que nuestras salidas de emergencia, donde están demarcadas, las dos salidas las pueden ver hacia atrás de ustedes, con salida hacia el patio San Francisco y también con salida hacia los estacionamientos. Voy a invitar al señor Leoncio Toro, co-head de Wealth Management de Pd.D. Pactual Chile, quien dará unas palabras de bienvenida.
Recién nuestra gerente de recursos humanos decía, ojalá las presentaciones de TG para practicantes estuvieran tan llenas como esta oportunidad, así que ojalá después podamos contar con hartos de ustedes. BTG desde hace varios años realiza el seminario Latam Focus, enfocado en temas económicos y de tendencia global. Es así como a lo largo del tiempo hemos traído a reconocidos economistas. Como todos saben, desde octubre del año pasado, Chile vive un periodo bastante especial. Muchos han dicho que se ha puesto en duda la institución y los avances logrados durante los últimos 30 años, y por lo mismo en nuestro seminario quisimos enfocarlo de alguna manera en esta problemática. Temas sobre desigualdad, crecimiento, Estado y sociedad son muy importantes las decisiones que se tomen para el futuro del país, y por lo mismo pensamos que los libros y postulados del profesor Acemoglu pueden ser un aporte en la discusión. En ese sentido, pensamos que debíamos contribuir con la comunidad y aprovechar la visita de Daron para que pudiera contarnos más a más personas de sus ideas que han tenido un alto impacto a nivel mundial. Y por último, un poco volviendo a lo anterior, digamos, como BTG siempre hemos estado muy interesados en captar talentos para nuestra compañía y creemos que contribuir de esta forma es una forma de hacerlo. Dejo ahora con ustedes al decano de la Facultad de Economía y Administración, José Miguel Sánchez, quien introducirá con más detalle al profesor Daron Acemoglu. Gracias.
Muy buenas tardes. Muchas gracias por venir a este seminario. Da gusto ver este seminario lleno. Este auditorio tiene pocos meses de vida. En octubre se inauguró recién. Hemos tenido 2 o 3 actividades y da gusto cuando se llena, y se llena con gente joven, muy motivada e interesada, y sobre todo con un speaker de la calidad que hoy día podemos presentar. El profesor Acemoglu es Institute Professor del MIT. Son pocos los Institute Professors de MIT. Es una categoría de la universidad que se reconoce a una persona que realmente ha hecho una contribución, o está haciendo una contribución muy destacada a nivel mundial. Voy a cambiar a inglés ahora para introducir al profesor y no dejarlo marginado de la explicación. It is my great pleasure to greet you all this warm afternoon. Y lo de warm afternoon es verdad. To listen one of the leading economists today in the world, whose intellectual work has had enormous influence and is having enormous influence not only in economics, but also in social sciences in general. He has published more than 140 articles in leading scholarly journals, including the American Economic Review, Econometrica, JPE, Quarterly Journal of Economics, and Review of Economic Studies, among others. He has also published 50 book chapters and 5 books published, among which the most famous one up to now is Why Nations Fail, written with Professor James Robinson. This book has become a must-read for everyone interested in development and in institutions. Today, he will talk about his most recent book, The Narrow Corridor, also written with Jim Robinson, about which main topic is liberty. He's going to be talking about liberty this afternoon. I am sure that his book and his talk will give us and provide us many clues that will help us understand better what we are currently living as a country here in Chile. Professor Acemoglu research covers a wide range of areas within economics, including political economy, economic development and growth, human capital theory, growth theory, innovation, search theory, network economics, and learning. In all of them, he has made substantial contributions. So it is a great honor, and we thank very much BitHip Actual that made possible to have Daron with us this afternoon. Thank you very much, and enjoy the talk.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I have many friends and some former students here, so it's particularly a nice occasion and nice place for me to visit. And I will be talking about The Narrow Corridor, the new book that James Robinson and I wrote. I want to explain what the book is about, but also take the liberty of providing an interpretation of the problems, challenges, and opportunities that Chilean society is facing today through the lenses of the framework. So the first thing I want to explain is why we wrote the book. After all, I'm an economist. James used to be an economist, is now a political scientist, but we're both interested in long-run economic development, economic inequality, issues of public services, and so on. So why write a book about liberty? Well, the reason is, and here's the Spanish cover, not the answer to the question. The reason is because we had already come long ago to the conclusion that institutions were critical to our understanding economic development. But over time, we also came to believe that to understand institutions in the most holistic and satisfactory way, we need to understand 2 pillars that are distinct but also deeply interact. The capacity of the state, which is how the state functions, what it is capable of doing and what it does, and the liberty of the people. And these 2, I'm going to argue, are not only critical for the questions that many of us care about, in particular for shared prosperity, but also they deeply depend on each other. So let me start with this picture. At some level, there is nothing extraordinary about this, especially in Chile, where we have seen a lot of protests lately, people gathering in some public square, in this instance, asking the government to take more robust action and regulate issues related to carbon emissions for combating climate change. Literally dozens of climate change rallies happen every month around the world. So at some level, you would think there aren't many clues about questions of state liberty and societal organization in this picture. But I will argue that there is something very unusual in this picture. In fact, from the viewpoint of global history, our existence on this planet as Homo sapiens for over 70,000 years, this is a remarkable picture. In fact, it's so remarkable that to our ancestors, it would not even be understandable. So most of our existence was spent in what anthropologists call small-scale or stateless societies, societies in which political and social organization is governed by norms, traditions, and state institutions are completely absent. In such societies, for people to go somewhere and protest so that the state does or does not do something would not make sense. But even more deeply, in these societies, as I will explain in a little bit, a lot of political activity is very tightly scripted. And what that means in particular, that for people for very different walks of life to come together, as you see there, teachers, professionals, children, parents with their young children, to come together for something that is not directly relevant for their lives, but they care about the future, that again is very, very difficult for people who have lived in these small-scale societies to understand. About 10,000 years or perhaps a little bit less, first state-like institutions start emerging. About 5,000 years ago, we see real state-like institutions, powerful states. So we might think perhaps something like this could happen in the public squares that big empires like the Sumerian or the Egyptian empires have built in thousands of years ago. No chance. This would not have been possible under those conditions either. When states first emerged, they were very nakedly repressive institutions intent on organizing society in a different way, oftentimes concentrating people in certain areas so that they could be put to work under the conditions that the elite controlling the state wanted to do, extract resources from them, reshape society in various different ways. People mostly preferred not to interact with the state. They fled the state, not going and protesting against it. If they ever protested for anything, it was to be let alone. So many of the rebellions in the past were tax rebellions where people would be asking not to be taxed, not to be interfered, or not to have their produce extracted, not to pay tribute to the state. But here we see something very different. People are actually coming from all walks of life, and they're not protesting about being let alone. They are asking for the state to shoulder greater responsibility, to intervene more in the economy in order to solve some problems that society is facing, in fact is going to be facing or is facing at the moment, but especially for the future generations. So how did we get there? And why is this relevant for liberty? And what is the relationship between liberty and the state? Well, I will argue that there are two critical clues about liberty in this picture. One is about the definition of liberty. What people want here is not just the freedom to make their own choices, but they also want something more from the government. Opportunities, the means for making those choices. So long ago, a number of philosophers recognized that liberty isn't just about some abstract notion that you are free to do what you want. It also requires you to have the means of carrying that through. For example, to say that you are free, but you have no education, you have no job, you have no access to health, that's not meaningful freedom. But secondly, even more importantly than that, this is about people's liberty in participating in politics. And that is not just an integral part of liberty, but it is also the protection for the institutional structure that enables people to participate in politics, that enables the state to become more competent and more responsive. And in fact, that is the central theme of our book, which we summarize in this picture. A very simple one, exceedingly simple, simplistic, of course you might say, for interpreting tens of thousands of years of human history. Well, any such picture, of course, is going to take some liberties with abstracting from details and simplifying things. But James and I have been somewhat draconian here. We've reduced everything to 2 dimensions. On the horizontal axis, I have the power of the state, which is how well organized is society. Sorry, on the horizontal axis, I have the power of society, which is how well organized society is, in particular in solving collective action problems and participating in politics. On the vertical axis, we have the power of the state, the capacity of the state to carry through its means. Can it regulate the economy? Can it resolve disputes? Does it have the courts? Do the courts work? Can it repress people if it chooses to do so? Can it contain violence? All of these are summarized in that power of the state. But power of the state is also intimately mixed with the power of the elites, because who controls the elites? The president, the prime minister, the elites behind the scenes sometimes, the king. So there is a connection about the distribution of political power in society between different segments. Now, on the lower left corner, that triangular area, what I have placed there is one of the many examples of the stateless small-scale societies that anthropologists have studied. The TIV, for example, which is a very large, actually settled set of people in central Nigeria. But the TIV, just like many other stateless societies, have some very distinctive features. And the most distinctive one, motivating this picture and motivating the way that I'm going to tell the rest of the story, is about state-society relations. So the fact that we are in that lower right-hand corner, southeast, is an indication of the fact that, though primitive, the TIV society is actually quite well organized around its norms and traditions. There are certain ways in which decisions are made. There's a very rigid social hierarchy. For example, men on top, women lower down, the older people on top. There may be chiefs in some of these stateless societies, even if their powers are limited. And most importantly, there are also many ways in which political hierarchy is limited. The TIV, like many other stateless societies, are obsessed with political inequality. They don't like somebody coming and claiming to be a political leader. They don't like somebody being the boss. They don't like somebody coming and bossing them. So a lot of norms are organized around cutting down to size people who become very powerful. And they don't like economic inequality either, because they think economic inequality begets political inequality. Better not to let the cat out of the bag, so they organize a lot of their economy to prevent trade, to prevent market exchange, to actually discourage a lot of people from accumulating assets, because that might undermine political hierarchy. But of course that has a predictable consequence. You don't build a state. If you cannot have somebody resolve the disputes and provide the public goods and coordinate the activity, how are you going to build the state? So that's why the arrows there, which are meant to represent the evolution of state-society relations, are pointing downwards, meaning that states don't get built, states don't really come into existence. On the left triangular area, the northwest, we have what we call a despotic Leviathan. This is, in many ways, similar to what the great English philosopher writing in the midst of the English Civil War thought was what we really needed. a very strong sea monster, the Leviathan, that would monopolize power and command things, and his command will be done, and as a result, order would be restored. The worst thing, Hobbes thought, would be, disorderly society, everybody fighting against everybody, nasty, brutish, short lives, and he thought that the only way of resolving that was a powerful state. But the problem is, in that corner, in that triangular area, that state is faced with no opposition, no input, no cooperation with society. It is a despotic Leviathan, both because it can dominate society and also because it doesn't have to listen to society's wishes, society's viewpoints. So if you think of the big empires and other states without sufficient bottom-up participation, they can get things done, but the things that they get done is what their leader, their king, their elite really think society needs. So the arrows there are pointing towards even weaker society. Why? Well, if you think of the situation of civil society in China, for example, you get a clue about that. It's very difficult for society to organize when you have such a all-seeing, all-powerful, self-imposing state on you. Now, the problem for liberty is that in the lower corner, you cannot have liberty because those social hierarchies and the lack of public services, lack of dispute resolution, lack of law is too overwhelming for anything we would associate with liberty. In the upper corner, we cannot have liberty because the state dominates everything, and you are definitely subject to the whim of the state. So, does that mean no liberty? That's what the book is about. We actually think, leading to this rather unusual picture from the point of view of history, there was a process that led us there. That's the area that's in the middle, which is eponymous with the book, gives this name to the book, the narrow corridor. So there is a corridor there which creates the conditions that somehow over time, gradually, treacherously, sometimes with ups and downs, leads to a different relation between state and society, different types of institutions, a different type of economy, and enables liberty to emerge. What are the distinctive features of that corridor? Well, first of all, as the picture highlights, it is a situation of balance. It's not society dominating the state or the state dominating society. It is a balance between the power of the two. What that means is that society can contest the state. In particular, it can object to the schemes and projects of the state if they go against its wishes, its beliefs, its interests, or at least the wishes, interests, or the beliefs of a significant fraction, or especially the vocal fraction of society. But even more importantly, the picture also highlights this is a narrow corridor. You really need this balance to be very much protected. And I'll come to that again in a second. But thirdly, and this is the most important point for now, it also emphasizes that the evolution of these sorts of institutions and the evolution of liberty itself is a process. You don't create it overnight by just entering it. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of effort, both on the side of state and society. Part of that is about competition. The contestation of power, the objections of society, which can sometimes be a messy affair. Some of that is about cooperation. One of the remarkable things that that figure suggests is that ultimately the arrows inside the corridor are going to higher levels than what the despotic Leviathan has. So if you ask somebody, where do you think strong, high-capacity states will emerge, your first instinct might be, well, wherever the state is stronger and more dominant. And that's what many political scientists and thinkers have suggested. But this picture proposes a different view, that ultimately it is this shackled Leviathan, not Hobbes's Leviathan, but a Leviathan shackled, controlled, monitored, and contested by society that ultimately achieves greater capacity. Why would that be? Well, our answer is about that cooperation. Because unless you have the cooperation of society, you cannot build the deepest form of capacity. People will not trust you. If they don't trust you, they will not share information with you. If you don't have the information, how can you resolve disputes? How can you provide the right public services? How can you regulate? But even more, you also need the prodding of society. We need more services. We need the right type of services, like the people here saying, no, we need more regulation from the state in this instance, because the problems we are confronting really need this sort of new actions. So that additional requirements on the shoulders of the state are going to be part of the process with which the capacity and the involvement of the state is going to grow over time. But making life in the corridor work is very difficult. Well, this was understood very well by the first civilization that really not only built that balance, but traveled along it for quite a while, ancient Greece. Ancient Athens, starting in late 7th century BC, built some of the best examples from history that we have of shackled Leviathan. How did they do that? Well, they did that by building both new institutions and transforming the ones they had and transforming the norms they had. And a central part of it was about popular participation in politics. Not only that, but also the same suspicion of political hierarchy that the TIV or other small-scale societies had that I mentioned, but they found very creative and new ways, more institutionalized ways of dealing with them, rather than just nipping in the bud the existence of the state altogether. So this here is, the name there is Themistocles. Themistocles was as close to a hero that ancient Athens ever had. He saved Athens against the Persian by first building, then commanding the navy. Then he correctly identified the problems that Sparta was posing. But this is not because Athenians were celebrating Themistocles, it's because they were exiling him. Cleisthenes, one of the founders of the Athenian Republic, passed a law called the Ostracism Law. Every year the assembly, which was elected popularly, would vote whether there would be an ostracism. If there would be an ostracism, every Athenian citizen would write the name of a person on a piece of broken shard, ostrakon, so that's where the name ostracism comes from, and whosever name was written most would get ostracized from the city for 10 years. So at some point they thought that despite his heroic past, Themistocles was getting too big for his boots, and they ostracized him. Now the remarkable thing is not that the Athenians were suspicious of power. Most societies have been. But the remarkable thing is that they found an institutional way of dealing with it. They developed norms, they developed institutions, including these democratic institutions such as assemblies, checks on the executives that were term limited for 1 year, assemblies that were term limited, but also things like the Ostracism Law or the Hubris Law, which Solon passed 100 years before Cleisthenes, which made it a capital offense to be too hubristic. So they were really worried about this, but they found institutionalized ways of dealing with it. So as a result, differently from the TIV or other small-scale societies, what you see is a very different evolution of the economy. Ancient Greece had 400 years of growth. It did so based on a very modern economy by the standards of the time. It developed an amazing state. It had money, monetary policy, circuit court judges, orphanages, social security. It implemented a very complex land reform. It set up various bureaucratic organizations. It regulated a lot of things in the economy while at the same time making a lot of technological breakthroughs. So it was this possibility of institutionally controlling power while at the same time cooperating with it that really made all of these possible. So the Greek story was very much one of growth in the corridor. And in fact, it really highlights another critical point, and now coming back to the economics, is that the nature of economic relations in the corridor are very different than outside. Many social thinkers, including Hobbes, very keenly understood that when the Leviathan is completely absent, economic investment opportunities are seriously hampered. Hobbes has some wonderful passages on that, and he thinks that industry, meaning economic activity, is impossible without a state. This view has permeated a lot of social science. Some great thinkers like Samuel Huntington and others have argued that you first need to develop the state in order for the economy to take off. So the view is here, you really need this very strong state. And in fact, if you compare places like this to places like this, it seems to confirm the Hobbes-Huntington thesis. The TIV, for example, when they first came into contact with the British towards the end of the 19th century, were some of the poorest people in sub-Saharan Africa, living at subsistence, having some of the lowest life expectancy on the continent, and that the continent was quite poor at the time. And throughout history, we've had many examples of growth under the gaze of the despotic Leviathan. But the nature of that growth is very different. It tends to be unequal. It tends to be from top down. And the Athenian growth was very different from that. It was much more experimental, a lot of people coming from different angles and bringing new ideas. It was a more equal sort of growth, not, of course, ignoring the fact that Athenians had slaves and were war-making, so it was, of course, not a paradise. But slavery actually played a much more limited role in Athens than places like Sparta, for example. So this is the general feature, that the nature of growth here is different. Much more equal, much more creative, much more experimental. And the nature of growth here also, because it is not based as much on experimentation and innovation, tends to have more of a limited nature, tends to run into hard limits, as many examples of despotic Leviathan experienced. But I want to point out a couple of other important ideas about the framework before delving into a possible interpretation of how to think about Latin America, and in particular Chile, a little bit from this framework. And the first thing I want to do is actually mention Europe. You know, any book, any thesis that claims to understand, to explain the long-run evolution of liberty, you know, has to say something about Europe, because we see all of these institutions take root in Europe sometime, you know, some people say 500 years ago, some people 1,000 years ago, some people say 2,000 years ago, but they have been durable. So how do we think about Europe? Well, the way that we think about Europe is very simple. We think that a set of fortuitous events put Europe into the corridor, and it was a very long, painful, uneven travel within the narrow corridor. But that perspective already goes against almost all of the viewpoints that have been developed for Europe. There was nothing manifest about the destiny of Europe. There was nothing that said that Europe had to develop this way. There was nothing in the geography of Europe, in the culture of Europe, in the religion of Europe, in the state system of Europe. Many of these things came out as an outcome. And what was that put Europe into this? Well, our story is about a balance, so what put Europe in there, in our telling, was a balance, was an unusual event, or two unusual events meeting together. The first unusual event was that a very sophisticated state system for its time, the Roman Empire, especially the Western Roman Empire, which had developed even more bureaucratized institutions than the Greeks by 4th and 5th centuries, 3rd, 4th centuries especially, collapsed and left a power vacuum. The blueprints, a lot of the administrative institutions, a lot of the parts of the judicial institutions survived, at least as ideas, as practices. The Catholic Church integrated into these institutions survived, but there was a power vacuum. And that power vacuum was filled by Germanic people migrating from the East. And what was distinctive about them, not so uncommon among war-making tribes, but more pronounced among the Germanic people, was that they have very bottom-up politics, what Chris Wickham, a historian, calls the assembly politics of the Germans. So a lot of decisions had to be made in assemblies, people had to have voice, chiefs had to be legitimized, chiefs could be changed, they could be elected. So this is what, really, about 1,000 years after Germans first make their appearance in Europe, Hincmar of Reims, who was a teacher of Carloman III, describes to him when he's coming to the throne, he says, erase any idea that you have in your mind that you can rule your realm as you wish. You're not going to command, but you have to get the consensus of the people. In particular, he says there have to be 2 assemblies, one for the lay people, for everybody, another one for the elite, clergymen and clerics and important men. And you need to consult with them, you deliberate with them. You cannot do this coercion, but they need to understand what you're doing and they need to agree to what you're doing. And he says this is exactly what Charlemagne used to do. But in fact, it goes way before Charlemagne, when Tacitus wrote the first ethnographic account of the Germanic tribes. That's exactly what he describes. He describes exactly these 2 assemblies that were part of the way that they made these decisions. So this confluence of factors, society's participation, and institutions inherited from the Western Roman Empire put Europe into the corridor. Was it a easy, smooth evolution? Far from it. It was a very painful one, not just because it was violent, not just because it had ups and downs, but just by its nature, building liberty is very difficult. There are many aspects to this, and several of them we talk in the book, but I want to talk about one of them because it's both important for our overall thesis, but it's also relevant for what I want to talk about next. One of the aspects of liberty is that norms have to change as well. Because the norms that I mentioned, for example, for the TIV or other stateless societies, they have their own various hierarchies that they impose. Some people on top, some people at the bottom. And those hierarchies are inimical to liberty as much as the state's despotic power. And if you doubt the power of those norms, you can see what we call the cage of norms in many places around you. But let me start not nearby, but far away, in India. So in many ways, India has a wonderful democracy. It's the biggest democracy, it's one of the most successful democracies. So in some sense, things should be great. The democracy should serve its people. Well, it doesn't do quite that well. And in fact, 200 million Dalits, untouchables, still are extremely poor. They don't have access to services, and they are systematically discriminated against. What you see there is a profession called manual scavenging. There might be 5 million manual scavengers in India. Those are people who manually clean latrines, human excrements, dead animal carcasses. It's a terrible job. It's amazingly dirty. It's amazingly demeaning. Nobody wants to do it. And you ask the Dalits, why do they do it? They say, well, this is the tradition. We are expected to do it. If we don't do it, we're shunned, we're ostracized, and worse, we're threatened with violence. So why should the Dalits, these 200 million people, be expected to do that? Is that the law in India? Well, far from it. The Indian constitution is written by a man named Ambedkar, who was himself a Dalit, and who understood the problem of the caste system very well, actually bans discrimination on the basis of caste. Ambedkar himself thought that caste was the scourge of India. It would underdevelop India. It would make Indian democracy not work. And he knew it firsthand because as a child he was continuously discriminated against. He was denied education. When he went to school, he had to sit separately from other children. He couldn't drink water because if he drank water from the same fountain as other Indian children, he would pollute them. And he was probably one of the more lucky untouchables, one of the more unlucky Dalits. But he deeply understood that caste divisions, society being divided against itself, would make democracy not work, the economy not work. So he banned, or he convinced others, actually with the opposition of Nehru and Gandhi, so it turns out, he convinced others to finally pass a constitution which outlaws any kind of discrimination on the basis of caste. But still this continues because norms are very difficult to change. So how do you change the norms? Well, you change them with the same process. The state working with society, with the prodding of society, but then interfering in the regulation of society in order to change some of those norms. And the reason why I think this is relevant is that even if not as extreme, anywhere, nowhere as extreme, the Latin American society has faced its own caste problem. So this is from one of the paintings called the La Castas from the Mexican 19th century, which is the Latin American caste system, with the colonists on top and Criollos at the next, and so on and so forth. Of course, it is a representation of 19th century, not the complete reality. Things had already started changing by the 19th century. But the same sort of norm-based social inequality is no stranger to Latin America. And that is actually very important to understand because I don't think it's irrelevant for the problems that we are seeing in parts of Latin America and in particular in Chile. You know, how can we think about Chile from this framework? Well, perhaps we don't want to think about Chile. We don't have to, not every framework has to fit every country. And some frameworks are more useful for some times than others. But I think there are some interesting lessons. Well, at some level, Chile is an enigma. It is the fastest growing country in Latin America. So here I show it in comparison to a bunch of other Latin American countries. And you see that starting as the poorest country in about 35 years or so, it became the richest and certainly the fastest growing. Still lower income per capita than the US or Canada, but a huge achievement. But it's an enigma because there is deep discontent, and part of that discontent is about inequality. Inequality is very high in Chile, even if it's not by any means highest. So if you look at the left, you see countries with Gini coefficients of 50, which is extremely high. Chile is somewhere in the middle of the pack. So there are several Latin American countries less than Chile, about 42, 43% Gini. But this level of inequality within such a highly growing country is actually clearly a problem. In fact, if you look at the Gini, which gives a picture of the overall inequality, in particular puts quite a bit of weight at what's going on at the bottom, that might hide some aspects of inequality. If you look at the top 1% share, how much the real economic elite are doing in terms of the share of the income, Chile is one of the most unequal. So this is from Pancho's, courtesy of Pancho. You see the darkest colors are between 19 and 30% of income going to the top 1%. Chile is among the most unequal in the world, together with the US and Russia and Saudi Arabia. See, most of Europe is in the 10 or 10-15 range, and even Argentina is lower. Now, inequality has been declining in Chile, but more or less at the same rate as the rest of Latin America. So starting from highs and coming to somewhat less highs. And there is some debate about how fast that's going on. So for example, from data from Jose Diaz, again, courtesy of Pancho, you see the last years, you see the decline in the red dots, but you know, Chile is still more or less in the same range as it has historically been in the 19th century. So it hasn't broken out of the very high unequal situation. So is inequality of income, things like top 1%, are they the root of the problems that Chile is having? I think a little yes, but somewhat no. Because I think there is something else which is even worse. And that's what I would say is inequality of social status. So inequality of income is about who holds the income. But what matters in many things in society is social inequality. Who has access to good jobs? Who has access to the best education? Who has access to political power, to voice, to status, to importance in society? And those things are very unequally distributed in Chile. It's a narrow set of elite who can get to the best jobs because they have the best education. The rest of the education system, the rest of the healthcare system, the rest of the opportunities don't work very well. And that inequality of social status in a fast-growing country really creates a big wall standing in the way of aspirations. And I think that is partly related, and it is the part of the reason why I have emphasized the norm-based social hierarchies and how they tend to be very long-lasting, but also a very important impediment. But then, if we want to understand this long-lasting nature, let's think a little bit about how Chile got here. And of course, I'm no expert on Chilean history, but here is one interpretation. One interpretation is that Chile forged a very interesting, unique, largely successful, but also somewhat problematic path, which you can call state capacity without liberty. So in terms of the graph, it was a despotic growth path, but with some important differences. You know, it's at the beginning, as you very well know, Chile started with a lot of disadvantages. It wasn't central to the Spanish Empire. It did not have gold or silver, and it did not have perhaps something more valuable, or at least in the Spanish eyes, more valuable than gold and silver, indigenous population that could be coerced and that would pay tribute, that could be put to work in encomiendas or in repartimientos or in the mita. So it was a marginal place. But it still had a somewhat high density of population in the Central Valley around Santiago, and this enabled it to develop its own landowning interests, native, domestic, as well as its nascent merchant class. And this group became very influential in politics, valuing several things. One, stability. This was the time where the rest of Latin America was going through these instability periods, and was very easy to fall into that instability trap if, like Peru or like Mexico, you had these deep divisions between the indigenous people, you had the inheritance of huge forced labor institutions. Chile was fortunate not to have them, but it also needed better state capacity in order to take part in international trade, which many parts of Latin America, starting sometime in the 19th century, wanted to do. So this created the right incentives for building state institutions, infrastructure, some sort of courts, some sort of order within Chile. Well, that worked quite well, because when you compare that to caudillo politics in Mexico, in Argentina, in Central America, that was much preferred. Haciendas may not be our ideal, but they're way better than complete chaos. And a lot of evidence from Latin America suggests that the sort of the infighting that pursued, especially after independence, was much more destructive. But, of course, this could not go on. Stability at the expense of elite domination created its own problems. And I think you can interpret the second half of the 20th century as a time of these problems being realized. Chile started a process of reform sometime early in the 20th century, but they were very timid. There was voting, but not really. There was political competition between conservatives and liberals and radicals, but not real serious competition. And one aspect of that was that Chilean law did not even allow secret ballots. So work by Jean-Marie Ballan and my co-author James Robinson, for example, looks at the influence of the 1958 law, which introduced secret ballots. So what they argue is that before the secret ballot, even though there were elections, they were meaningless. And one of the reasons why they were pretty much meaningless is because a lot of people were coerced to vote for one candidate or another, and especially the inquilinos, the dependent laborers. They were at the behest of their powerful landlords, and if the landlords told them to do something and they didn't, they would be kicked out. And in a world where you did not have a social safety net, you did not have any other economic opportunities, that would be economically disastrous. So on the left, you see the vote share of right-wing parties as a share of total vote, as a function on the horizontal axis of the share of inquilinos in the municipality in 1955. So the more of these dependent peasants you had, the higher was the vote share of the right-wing party. And after the next election, after 1958, the secret ballot is introduced. Now you can tell whatever you want to your inquilinos, but they don't have to do it. They go and vote in the privacy of the booth. Suddenly that relationship disappears. So that sounds great. So real democracy, step by step coming, and then there were also further reforms increasing competitiveness in the political process in the 1960s. So is this what we would want? So what we call path one there. So you move into the corridor starting with too powerful a state. The state capacity is there, but society is weak, so perhaps we just move in here. Well, not so fast, because, you know, when you start a process of opening up, finding the right compromise, finding the right balance is not that easy. The corridor is narrow, difficult to get into, and difficult to stay in. So you can interpret the Frey government's reforms in the 1960s, for example, as controlled but significant reforms, economically, socially, politically, including land reform, including better social services, as a way of accompanying and making that compromise possible. But they weren't sufficient. People wanted more. Workers organized in the countryside as well as in the cities. Labor strikes skyrocketed in the late 1960s, and this discontent brought the left-wing coalition led by Salvador Allende to power. Well, was that going to start a process of better state building with more services, public services, better balance in society? Perhaps, perhaps not. You know, the problem was that Allende's coalition wasn't a classic social democratic one. It had, including Allende himself, there was a great belief in nationalizing means of production. It's what he called and what many people call the democratic socialist agenda. And they were quite uncompromising. But the uncompromising attitudes was even more pronounced on the side of the elites. The whole middle class were not too happy with these things. So you had what Allende himself predicted when he said Chile is going to shake more than a soccer ball kicked by Pele. That's exactly what happened, but not in a good way. And Chile fell victim to further polarization and a military coup, most likely possibly backed by the CIA, but supported by a lot of the Chilean middle class. Well, that might appear like the end of the Chilean experience to get into the narrow corridor, but in fact, something very different happened. You know, 18 years thereafter, we see Chilean democracy reemerge, and reemerge on the basis of a much more of a compromise, that each side trying to find a way of making it work, and that I think was very important for the development of Chilean economy and the development of Chilean society. Now the question is, today, given that that compromise happened, but it did not really resolve economic inequality, and it certainly did not resolve social inequality, are we living through another period like the 1960s, where polarization is going to get heightened, and we're going to see more and more conflict between the left and the right, between the elites who drag their heels and the left who wants more and more reforms, and the agreement set is empty and the corridor disappears. Well, there is a danger. I don't think complacency is ever justified, especially in this day and age when you see a lot of democracies shaking with fear at the rise of authoritarian populism and many of them falling, complacency would be the most dangerous thing. But I do also think that there are several reasons why today is very different than the 1960s. And Chilean society is very different, and the options open to Chilean society is very different. And I will argue that there are in particular 3 factors that we need to think about, that are signs of hope, even if not reasons for to be complacent. The first one is that the shape of the corridor greatly matters. So here is a really narrow corridor, here is a somewhat wider corridor. Getting into the wider corridor is easier, and more importantly, once you are in the wider corridor, you can have gyrations, fluctuations, but you still stay in there. Out of a narrow corridor, you get out. What makes the corridor narrow versus wide? Several factors, but one very important one is the nature of economic relations. If you have a coercion-based, land-based economy, that makes the corridor much narrower. So one based on the inquilinos, large landowners, before any land reform and semi-coercive practices, was one that was not very conducive to that sort of compromise, to the balance between state and society being formed. Today, Chile has much more developed economy, much more based on human capital, none of that coercive labor relations are left, so there's much greater room for maneuver. You can have some violence in the streets, but that doesn't mean that tomorrow the tanks are going to roll. Second, and illustrating another important part of our theory, differently from many other social science theories, our approach says structural factors, factors that determine various conditions around you, are not destiny. They are influences that you yourself shape. And to illustrate that, for example, let me give the most famous, perhaps most famous, instance of a theory about why state capacity develops. The political sociologist Charles Tilly influenced much of political science of the late 20th century by arguing, states are really about war. In his pithy statement, states made war and war made the state. So the argument is, we owe the modern states and all of that judicial bureaucratic capacity, all of that taxation power, because rulers wanted to build big armies, and to do that they had to raise taxes, they had to have a bureaucracy, they had to have conscription, they had to reorganize agriculture, and all of these things led to the states. Well, there is some truth to that, but there is as much falsehood. And the reason is very clear when you look at this picture. You can think of what Tilly is saying is that starting with the military revolution, the possibility of using muskets and these mass armies, the state or the demand on the state grows, but that can bring you into the corridor like Switzerland, or it can take you out of the corridor like Prussia. It's really about the prevailing balance and as much about what you do with the changes in environments. The same is true for new economic opportunities, the same is true for demographic challenges, the same is true for new technologies, and the same is true when it comes to critical junctures such as the one that Chile is in. So it is society's choice how to change its own rules, its own institutions, its own way of approaching both the economy and society at large. And in this, I want to end with a previous episode in which we've lived through similar events. And in the process, argue that in fact there is a logic, a very powerful logic for good reforms within the corridor that will become self-reinforcing and in fact not only increase equality, equal opportunity, but also increase the state's capacity and society's positive involvement in politics. And for that, let me go to the period of the Great Depression and its aftermath, when the whole of the Western world was shaken by great economic uncertainty. And some countries fell to fascist regimes, including Germany, Italy. Many others came close to, yet many others came up with a solution of providing the first example of the social welfare state. According to this, the state would play more of a role in protecting citizens, redistributing income, providing health care, protecting children. And one emblematic version of this was the Beveridge report that was published by a government committee led by William Beveridge, previously the director of the London School of Economics, my alma mater, and a very important liberal intellectual at the time. It was an amazing document. You see pretty much everything that Western governments in the post-war period throughout the continent implemented, and a lot of what US did already in this document: minimum wage, national health service, progressive taxation, social security, pensions, and so on. It was completely transformative. The British war effort was completely energized by the Beveridge report. And as soon as the war was over, the British governments, both conservative and Labour, started implementing it. But a brilliant emigre from Austria, who had fled the Nazis, was very worried. Hayek had started teaching at the LSE, and when he saw the Beveridge report, he immediately wrote a memo to Beveridge. Then he turned it into an essay, and then he turned it into a book, one of the most important social science books of the second half of the 20th century, The Road to Serfdom. So Hayek thought that this was the beginning of a new totalitarianism. In Hayek's view, there was no difference if you made the state too powerful, whatever the reason it was, that was going to extinguish liberty. So he said, in ways that actually resonate with the framework that I have presented, it says, this means, among other things, that even a strong tradition of political liberty, so society is organized, is no safeguard if the danger is precisely that new institutions and policies will gradually undermine and destroy that spirit. So he thought, if you build this administrative state that interferes too much in politics, it's going to be the end of liberty. Well, it turned out that Hayek was wrong. And Hayek was wrong for two reasons, and both of them are instructive. One I've already mentioned, that Hayek had a very narrow definition of liberty. For him, liberty was just being let alone. But that's not what people wanted. You know, we wrote this book about liberty because we argue in the book that liberty is a basic need and basic want of human beings. And human beings don't want just to be let alone. They also want to have the opportunities to realize their plans. They have the security to have the opportunities to participate in economic and social life. And the reason why there was so much discontent, that people thought everything else was meaningless in the midst of the Great Depression and its aftermath, when they did not have jobs, when they did not have access to health care, their children did not have access to education, they were afraid that their families would starve. So this narrow conception of liberty as where we should stop was not satisfactory. But more deeply, the reason why Hayek pessimistic take on this did not come to realize is because Hayek thought that when you strengthen the state, you go out of the corridor. But there is something else. The corridor, as I said, is a process. And in particular, we can strengthen the state while we're also strengthening society. And in fact, what people I showed you in the first picture, when they were arguing for more climate action, they were asking, just like many people, millions of people in Europe and in the other different parts of the world in the aftermath of the Great Depression, they were asking for the state to shoulder greater responsibilities so that it would help them. But as part of that, in many places, it was also for society to get more involved in politics. And one place where that is very well illustrated is the first place which did comprehensive social welfare reforms in Sweden after the Workers' Party came to power in 1932. They formed first the Red-Green coalition with the farmers, a very broad coalition, and then they brought the businessmen into the coalition, and they adopted much greater levels of taxation, much greater levels of public spending. They organized collective bargaining, but under the control and based on agreements and compromise. They encouraged capital accumulation. So there was social democrat. The Workers' Party had completely split from the Communist Party. So they reaffirmed their commitment to private businesses, private innovation, private capital. But at the same time, it was a regulated environment. And within this environment, they created a very active social welfare state. But differently from what Hayek feared, Society also got very involved. The wage setting was very much done with collective bargaining. Trade unions oversaw a lot of the public programs, including Social Security. The democracy deepened, democratic participation increased. And this is not unique to Sweden. It happened first in much of Scandinavia, then in Germany, then in France, then in Netherlands, then in Belgium, and the UK. So throughout Europe, and I would say also the US in a very lopsided way, but still it also happened in the US and Canada, it was a process of the state shouldering greater responsibilities. That's why state budgets from being about 5% at the beginning of the 20th century increased to somewhere between 40 to 50% in much of the OECD. But in all of these cases, it went together with deeper democratization. So this is the third element for why I think it's different here, that Chile, being in the corridor, has an opportunity to do exactly the same thing that many European governments did: strengthen state capacity, strengthen responsibilities of the state, while at the same time making society participate more positively in politics. So I think Chile can prove Hayek wrong again. So now I'll stop there. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, profesora Acemoglu. Ahora invito a pasar adelante a la destacada periodista Angélica Bulnes para que nos acompañe y modere las preguntas del público.
¿Aló, aló? Sí.
Perfect. Gracias.
Ahí sí. Ahí estamos bien. Bueno, muy buenas tardes a todas y todos. And thank you, Daron, for your presentation, for being here with us today. And thank you to the Facultad de Economía de la Universidad Católica por esta invitación tan interesante. You are talking about enhancing the narrow corridor, so I'm not going to keep the microphone for myself. I'm just going to ask you a few questions, and then I will share it with the public, so you can start preparing your questions. Anyway, we will not going to have too much time, so just a few questions, but we will go there. But my first question is, I know, Daron, that you have said that you are not an expert in Chile, but you have been following our path as a country since many years ago, since the first book that you wrote with James Robinson, which is not Why Nations Fail, but Economic Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. And you already in your presentation show us that you know quite a lot about Chile. So I would like to ask you, what did you think when you heard about our current crisis? Were you expecting something like that, or it was a surprise for you?
You know, I think at some level, when I was, for example, here last 6 years ago, I did think that despite this huge success that Chile had in many, many, many aspects, in growth, in to some degree reducing inequality, there was still a lot of social inequality, and that was a tension that was visible even 6 years ago. But I was never, I would have never thought, and I never thought that it would erupt into violence. So the violence aspect definitely surprised me, because I think my interpretation was, you know, even if there was a lot of discontent, Chile had already found a path of leaving, any sort of violent intervention in politics behind, and it was a very firm democracy, and violence from both sides was something that saddened and shocked me. But I think at the end, it is idiosyncratic in some sense, but the whole event is a reflection of this tension that we are seeing.
wasn't that a surprise. But talking about the violence, is that an exception? Because you have said the society, civil society, is always like struggling with the state, but violence is not the norm. Do you think that the Chilean case, what we are seeing, is an exception in the struggle?
I think, you know,
the microphone answers the question. What can we do to stop provoking that?
I think it may be that when you speak, I can turn mine off, and when I speak, let me try.
Oh, that's
Okay. So, you know, this actually, thank you, you brought up my first book with Jim Robinson, Economic Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. You know, the view that we espouse there is the threat of revolution, the threat of unrest, is an important trigger for political change. And so in some sense, there is, in the grand scheme of things, there is nothing unusual about people pouring into the streets and having robust demands and civil disobedience, sometimes that translating into more violent actions. But in some sense, the picture that emerges from that book, and also what we sort of espouse in Narrow Corridor, is that that works and is most effective when it translates into some type of compromise. So the more successful cases that we recount in Economic Origins are those where the threat of unrest acts like a jolt, wakes up the elite, and the elite take action. They say, okay, we're going to make the right concessions so that we find a new social contract, we find a new social compact around which people can come together. And that happens time and again in Western Europe. It happens to some degree also in Latin America. But then there are cases, and those are the ones that sometimes are predictable, sometimes they are sad and unpredictable, where none of that compromise happens. If you want to think of examples, you need to look no further than the last few years in the Arab Spring. The hope in the Arab Spring is that people would pour into the street, and that would lead to the fall of dictators like Mubarak and Bashar al-Assad, and then there would be some, not easy, but some feasible path to more democratic politics and a better, fairer organization of economy. Of course, nothing like that happened except for Tunisia. And in many cases, the regime responded with overwhelming force, as in the case of Syria or Iraq or Libya. And in many of these cases, well, in Syrian case at least, they survived too. So in other cases, that violence led to a chaotic exit, like in Libya. So if violence becomes endemic, I think it becomes self-defeating even for those who want to change, because you know, violence both does not lead to the sort of social agreement that is necessary for rebuilding institutions, for building states, for improving laws, but it also creates a very different political dynamic. One leader espousing to be more violent than another, and being more uncompromising than another, and I think those are exactly the wrong type of dynamics.
You spoke about elites, and actually we are in the middle of a very prestigious university and a very influential business school here in Chile. I can see some former ministers here, academics, students, so we are definitely in the middle of a part of the elite, soon to be elite, because I can see many young faces. So what would you like to say to the Chilean elite at this moment as a kind of recommendation or something?
Well, I think, you know, I will come back to the same theme, but I'll say it somewhat differently. I see no other way for Chile, and in fact, for this also applies to several other Latin American countries, than to refashion their institutions based on a new social compact. And that critically depends on some sort of compromise. And compromise, it takes two to tango. You know, both sides would need to make concessions. And that requires leadership, it requires vision, it requires the right type of communication. You know, in the book we give the example of the apartheid's end. You know, of course, I don't want to draw any parallels between South Africa and Chile. Even in the worst conditions that Chile has in terms of social inequality, it cannot be compared to a regime that disenfranchised 80% of its people. It put them under coerced labor conditions. It banned black South Africans from holding any skilled occupations. It was a police state with huge degree of repression. But what's the parallel is that it required a new compromise and a new social contract to be written. Even though parts of the white elite supported ANC, and ANC had promised to give up its violent struggle as early as the 1980s, there was a real apprehension all around. You know, South Africa was going to write a new constitution, but what if white businesses were expropriated? What if whites felt insecurity? What if they felt like now second-class citizens in this country in which they were going to be a minority? So Nelson Mandela went out of his way, together with some of the other leaders of the ANC, to make sure that that wasn't the case. The Constitution reaffirmed property rights while also providing a lot of new rights and protections for black South Africans, and it was the beginning of the emergence of the black middle class. But he was also brilliant in symbolically capturing the moment. And one came in the 1996 Rugby World Cup. You know, South Africa was allowed to compete in the Rugby World Cup for the first time. Until then, because of the sanctions against the apartheid state, they were banned. And the South African rugby team was very much a white, actually an Afrikaner creation. So it was one of the most intense racist organizations. It was hated by the blacks, by the trade union movements, by the whole of ANC. But South Africa rose to the finals. So the question was, what was Nelson Mandela going to do? How was he going to handle this situation? Well, it turns out he handled it brilliantly. He turned out to the match wearing the jersey of the Springboks, the South African rugby team. In fact, the number of Pinar, the captain of the team, an Afrikaner himself. And he cheered the team, and the team won, and he used that as a great occasion for creating a new understanding between the two ends that needed to come together. So I think what the Chilean elite need to do, in the same way that what the Chilean left need to do, I think find the same sort of inspiration to find a common ground and the right symbolic as well as the real gestures so that a compromise for a new social compact can be formed.
Thank you. Quiero ofrecer el micrófono. Veo hartas manos. Voy a necesitar ayuda acá para que hagan circular el micrófono.
En primer lugar, muchas gracias por la tremenda presentación, es un honor poder...
Un poquito más fuerte.
En primer lugar, muchas gracias por la presentación, es un honor poder escuchar esta charla. Quiero hacer una pregunta bien rápida en dos partes. Una, estamos frente a un proceso, probablemente a un proceso de que se apruebe una nueva constitución y que haya un debate bien abierto con respecto a eso. ¿Cuál cree que son las medidas que deberían estar en esta nueva constitución que puedan asegurar una mayor representatividad democrática en la población? Y, en segundo lugar, si en el contexto del siglo XXI cree que es un deber moral o un deber utilitario, si se puede colocar en términos más liberales, la lucha contra la inequidad. Eso.
¿La lucha contra qué?
La inequidad.
Ya, escoge una o dos. He's asking about what do you think about the constitutional process in which we are now starting to discuss, and what do you think would be important to consider in a new constitution to enhance our democracy?
So let me answer that question. I think the Constitution provides a perfect example for what I wanted to say in response to, in my last comments, which is, you know, thinking of it as a new social compact, but also thinking of it as a way of not polarizing, but creating new compromises. You know, I think Chile needs a new constitution because the old one still has the hallmarks of the military regime, even though it's been reformed quite significantly. But imagine that we go now to a constitutional convention or constitutional committee, and one side of that says, we want a new constitution that abolishes private property. You know, that would further, you know, that would just be the end of everything that Chile has achieved. Or another side says, no, we're not going to accept anything other than exactly what Pinochet wrote in the Constitution. That would be the end of it as well. So the question is, how can we find the new common ground? And I think that is about compromise. That is about, I would say, about liberty. What are the things that the state owes to its citizens? There are two ways of thinking about constitutions. Most law, throughout history, has been an element of state control. The laws, if you look at many constitutions that were written in the 19th century, many in Latin America, are about how the state controls citizens and what the citizens owe to the state. But I think modern constitutions, exemplified by many Scandinavian ones, some like the West German one, are about not just what the citizens owe to the state, but much more about what the state can do for the citizens. And I think that's the sort of constitution, and you can start with one of those as a model, not take that as given, but build on it, but reaffirm that what we want is a state that functions and provides some of the rights and opportunities for people, while at the same time also upholding private property, the ability of businesses to function, the ability of the Chileans to flourish in the international world.
¿Quién tiene el micrófono? Nos quedan dos preguntas más, porque después tengo que liberar a Daron.
Okay. Muchas gracias por la charla, Daron. Estuvo fantástica. Quería consultarte sobre pensar en el futuro global. Estamos frente a una crisis climática que va a hacer que todas las economías del mundo tengan que pensarse y repensarse de una manera diferente. Here. Pensándolo así, tú siempre hablas en tus libros de países en particular, los modelos del Leviatán y qué sé yo, pero ¿qué pasa cuando pensamos en un narrow corridor globalmente, frente a una crisis climática? ¿Cómo lo ves tú? ¿Cómo lo proyectarías? Porque yo veo que es el paso que viene. O sea, en el fondo podemos tener una crisis en Chile y en muchos países se están produciendo crisis que son por esta crisis climática también, porque se produce desigualdad. ¿Cómo lo ves tú? Muchas gracias.
So the question is about the climate change and the climate crisis. And is it possible to think about like an international narrow corridor to face these kind of challenges?
It's a great question. First of all, I completely agree. I think climate change is an existential crisis for humanity. And, but it isn't also the only one, which is a problem that we cannot deal with just national institutions. We need supranational institutions. But that is just a very difficult question. So it was something we avoided in Why Nations Fail. And then when people said, well, what about the international...
She found the main point in the book. The main problem.
We said, well, we'll do that next. And then now with Narrow Corridor, we'll do that next, perhaps. But let me say a few things. I think many problems that we are facing today, from privacy to security, including terrorism, to regulation of global business, to international trade, tax evasion, and of course climate change, they all need international institutions. But European Union, which is probably the most successful international supranational institution and has been to some degree integral to the amazing success that Western Europe had in the post-war period, shows how difficult that is. It's not stable, there's always discontent. How do you make such an institution really responsive? You know, in some sense, something I did not talk about, and we spent quite a bit of time in Narrow Corridor, is things are easier at the local politics level. Local politics is about providing services, and once you provide those services, that's a good way for building the cooperation, the trust in institutions. When you go to the national, you can leverage the local sometimes, but with enough participation, you can do it at the national level too, but at the supranational, it's really hard. You know, Athenians were lucky because it was such a small society when you're trying to do it for billions of people, but we also need to do it urgently, and I think we need to take urgent action on climate change, and I think it's a very complicated problem. One of the aspects of it is that the longer we don't do something, the harder it becomes to do something about it, but also the longer we don't do something, I think the voices for more radical action, like completely choosing no growth or trying to sort of take very, very radical actions to stop businesses functioning would gain traction. And I think a much better path of taxing carbon, regulating the use of emissions in many different domains, but at the same time also building renewable energy, I think that's a much more feasible path that has had actually great success. Over the last 40 years, one of the amazing successes we've had that not enough people talk about is actually in renewable energy. 40 years ago, there was no option of using renewable energy. Today, renewable energy is cost effective together against carbon. So the way that we achieve that is actually with very light regulation. We should have done much more, but even with that right regulation and limited support for new technologies, we have made renewable energy more or less cost effective. So I think there's a lot to be done if there is even the minimal amount of coordination, and we better do that fast.
Yo creo que le toca a este lado, a alguien de este lado. Esta es la última que tenemos. Ahí va la manena con el micrófono.
Hi, my name is Francisco. We are in an elite university, and in this sense, I was wondering about the inequalities of treatment, like racism, colonialism, who you're talking about. And actually, some days in this university, the people say, I can see your ID or you're really studying this university, and I like to know more politics about to overcome the inequality of the treatment of the people.
I think, you know, the problem, if I'm understanding the question, is, you know, when inequality takes the form that there are elite universities and those are the gateways to the better jobs, to better status, you know, that's better than if your family name is the marker for status. And I think that's why Chilean society has much greater social mobility today than it had in the beginning of the 20th century. But the problem, of course, is that when you start from a situation of inequality, and there are few good positions in the education system and the rest of the education system doesn't work, and there are few good jobs that act like gateway to become CEOs and business leaders, then those tend to go to people who start with advantages in terms of what they can provide to their children, in terms of their social network, in terms of their family human capital. So it tends to replicate itself. But obviously, I think for institutions such as University of Chile or Católica, being more open to every part of the cross-section of Chilean society is one step, but I don't think it's a sufficient step. If you look at the US, for example, which is definitely not the place where you should look at in terms of dealing with problems of inequality, but still we can take some lessons, the evidence shows that, you know, Harvard, MIT, Stanford, they don't play much of a role in reducing inequality. If you are coming from a low-income background in the United States, the typical path for you to move into the upper middle income is to go to one of the state universities, University of Massachusetts, Michigan State University. So not the elite universities, not the hardest one to get into, bigger, but still very high quality. So I think that's what's missing in the education system in Chile. Some low-income people will get into the University of Chile, but the rest, when they go to the rest of the institutions, especially for-profit places that are not quality regulated, they really are not going to act like that stepping stone to higher social mobility. And I think that's why the education system needs to be fixed. And that's why, you know, Chile, just like many other Latin American countries, needs more tax revenue so that it can spend more on education and on healthcare. You know, one of the remarkable things about many countries is that even when they develop their economies, sometimes they don't increase their tax revenue. So one of the things that democracies often do, and Chile has done after the transition from Pinochet regime, but not enough, is they increase their tax revenue so that they spend more on health, on education, and other social programs. And that acts like a way of both creating more shared prosperity and the foundations for future growth. And I think Chile needs to do more of that, both in health and in other social parts, and education included.
Daron, I saw you this morning with our Ministry of Finance, Ignacio Briones, and I also heard that you met him yesterday. He's a big fan of you. So to close this conversation, I would like to get your impression. Is he talking in that direction? What do you think?
To me, he talked in that direction. You are to decide.
That's all? You're a good politician as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this conversation. A big applause. Speakers don't get this kind of applauses those days in Chile, so feel very proud. Bueno, muchas gracias a todos por esta conversación esta tarde y muchas gracias a la Facultad de Economía por la invitación. Buenas tardes.